For more than 5 decades, Goldie Hawn was Hollywood's promise of happiness. She laughed when others raged, smiled when others broke, and turned lightness into a career-long shield. But behind that warmth lived something far less visible: fear, panic attacks, and a memory that never forgot disrespect. Now at 79, Goldie Hawn is no longer protecting anyone else's comfort, and the truth she has quietly carried is finally surfacing. The woman behind the smile. Goldie Hawn has often said that the greatest misunderstanding about her career is the assumption that joy came easily. It didn't. Long before audiences adored her laugh, she was battling panic attacks that arrived without warning, leaving her confused, frightened, and questioning her own identity. She later admitted she wasn't feeling joyful at all, but terrified, struggling to understand what was happening inside her body and mind. Hollywood, however, had no patience for fear hidden behind beauty. It wanted her bright, agreeable, endlessly charming, and above all silent when disrespected. By the late 70s, Goldie had already become one of the most bankable stars in the industry. She had an Oscar, box office power, and a carefully cultivated image as America's sweetheart. But that image became a liability. Men in power mistook her kindness for weakness, her comedy for incompetence, and her optimism for naivete. She learned quickly that the industry rewarded women who endured humiliation quietly and punished those who pushed back. Goldie chose a different route. She remembered everything. She never screamed on sets, never stormed into the press, never exposed anyone publicly. Instead, she kept a list. Not written down, not announced, but deeply internalized. A private blacklist of men who crossed a line and never earned forgiveness. Some were co-stars who turned toxic once cameras stopped rolling. Others tried to charm her, then retaliated when she refused. A few dismissed her outright, reducing her decades of work to a punchline. Each incident reinforced a lesson Goldie learned the hard way. Peace mattered more than prestige. This wasn't bitterness. It was survival. As her panic attacks intensified over the years, she became fiercely protective of her emotional environment. She stopped chasing validation and started choosing distance. That decision reshaped her career, quietly but permanently, and the first man who forced her to make that choice did it on a comedy set that looked carefree to the world. Chevy Chase and the set that broke the illusion. When foul play reached theaters, audiences saw playful chemistry and effortless humor between Goldie Hawn and Chevy Chase. Behind the scenes, the experience was anything but playful. Chevy arrived on set already carrying a reputation shaped by his time on television, and that reputation quickly hardened into something darker. According to multiple crew members, he treated the production like a personal kingdom, improvising without warning, refusing takes he disliked, and undermining the director's authority whenever it suited him. Goldie tried to keep the atmosphere light. She joked with the crew, smoothed over tension, and stayed professional even as Chevy's behavior grew more erratic. But his ego flared whenever she landed a laugh. He sulked, muttered insults, and insisted on rewriting scenes to center himself. Crew members recalled him snapping at technicians, mocking dialogue, and openly questioning Goldie's comedic ability despite her proven success. At one point, he reportedly sneered that she was lucky to be in his orbit. What hurt most wasn't the insults themselves, but the contempt beneath them. Goldie later confided to friends that she had never felt more disrespected by a co-star. The set became emotionally exhausting, with people walking on eggshells just to get through the day. One makeup artist remembered everyone simply wanting to reach the wrap party without an explosion. Chevy, meanwhile, seemed either oblivious or entertained by the chaos. By the end of filming, the two barely spoke. Studios pushed hard for future collaborations and sequels, dangling money and influence, but Goldie refused without hesitation. She told her agent only 2 words: "Not interested." That silence became her boundary. From that point forward, there were no nostalgic interviews, no reunion photos, no softening of the story. Chevy Chase was permanently removed from her professional world, and he never found his way back in. But the next name on her list didn't begin with a set conflict. It began with rejection, and it escalated into something far more calculated. Warren Beatty and the punishment of rejection. By the time Goldie Hawn crossed paths with Warren Beatty, she already understood how power worked in Hollywood. Beatty wasn't just a leading man, he was a gatekeeper. His influence extended far beyond casting into reputations, access, and long-term career trajectories. In the late 70s, when he set his attention on Goldie, it followed a familiar pattern. Invitations to dinners, private parties, and carefully curated social circles where favors were traded casually and expectations went unspoken. To many actresses, this kind of attention came with an unspoken price. Goldie declined politely, repeatedly. She didn't embarrass him, didn't confront him, didn't make a scene. She simply refused to play along. That refusal marked a turning point. According to people close to her, the charm vanished almost immediately. In its place came subtle retaliation. Scripts she had been promised stopped materializing. Meetings were canceled without explanation. Producers who once sounded enthusiastic suddenly grew distant. In private conversations, she began hearing the same phrase repeated in different forms. She was difficult, not serious enough, too comedic. Nothing was ever explicit. That was the cruelty of it. Beatty didn't need to sabotage her loudly. He let doubt do the work. He planted questions in the right ears, framed as concern or professional judgment. Goldie recognized the tactic instantly. If he couldn't have her, he would diminish her. And for a time, it worked. The early years of the following decade were marked by near misses and vanished opportunities that made no sense on paper. Goldie never confronted him publicly. She understood how that would end. Instead, she adjusted. She stopped chasing prestige roles that required the approval of men like him and focused on projects where she retained control. Privately, she was more honest. To friends, she described Beatty as someone who didn't handle rejection, who punished it. That sentence became shorthand for everything she endured during that period. Years later, at a major awards event, Beatty approached her as if nothing had ever happened, smiling with nostalgic familiarity. Goldie smiled back, cool and polite, then turned away mid-sentence and walked off. Witnesses described the moment as icy and definitive. It wasn't anger, it was finality. She had closed that door long ago and thrown away the key. The next man on her list didn't punish her quietly. He humiliated her openly in a room designed to test power. Dustin Hoffman and the audition that shattered trust. Goldie Hawn entered the casting room believing she had earned the right to be there. She wasn't chasing relevance. She was expanding it. The role was dramatic, the kind critics respected, and she approached it with seriousness and restraint. Dustin Hoffman was already attached, celebrated for his intensity and method approach. What unfolded between them wasn't collaboration. It was dominance. Mid-scene, Hoffman stopped her cold. He criticized her delivery, then turned to the producers and dismissed her performance as sitcom level. The room laughed, uncertain whether this was humor or hostility. Goldie felt the distinction immediately. This wasn't direction. It was humiliation delivered with precision. Hoffman wasn't testing chemistry. He was asserting control. She finished the reading calmly, thanked everyone, and left. The next morning, she withdrew from the project entirely. According to insiders, she told her agent she wouldn't fight for respect in rooms where her talent had already been reduced to a joke. Attempts were made to repair the situation, to smooth things over, to frame the incident as misunderstanding or creative tension. Goldie declined them all. What lingered wasn't the lost role, but the moment of self-doubt it triggered. She later admitted that for a split second, she questioned herself, and that realization disturbed her more than Hoffman's words. He hadn't exposed a weakness in her acting. He had tried to cut at her confidence. She recognized it as a tactic used by men who needed to feel larger by shrinking others. Years later, she reflected publicly that some men forget they are not directing the women around them. Those who knew her understood exactly who she meant. She never worked with Hoffman again. She didn't need to explain herself. Her absence spoke clearly enough. After that experience, Goldie began drawing firmer lines. But even she wasn't prepared for the next confrontation, one that arrived disguised as comedy and chaos. Bill Murray and Sean Penn, cruelty in different forms. Bill Murray entered Goldie Hawn's orbit during early talks for a studio comedy. From the first table read, the imbalance was obvious. He arrived late, unapologetic, placing his coffee on the script as if the work itself were disposable. As the reading began, he veered wildly off script, mocking dialogue, undermining beats, and turning scenes into private showcases for his unpredictability. Writers sat frozen. Goldie tried to adapt, but the tone felt wrong. Then came the comment. In front of the room, Murray questioned her ability to handle drama, delivering the line with a smirk that invited laughter. Others obliged. Goldie didn't. She closed her script and left quietly. There was no confrontation, no press leak. The next day, her team informed the producers she was out. Later, she described his behavior as exhausting, not genius. That moment changed how she chose roles. She stopped tolerating men who confused disrespect with spontaneity and opted out of entire categories of projects that required emotional babysitting. If Murray's cruelty hid behind charm, Sean Penn's was blunt and public. At a high-profile charity gala focused on mental health, Goldie delivered a speech rooted in personal experience and vulnerability. Penn, seated nearby, made his disdain clear, rolling his eyes and muttering dismissive remarks. After the applause, he reduced her entire career to a single sneer, suggesting she stick to giggling. Goldie smiled and left early. In private, she was devastated, not because her ego was bruised, but because something deeply personal had been mocked. She later said that after decades of work, she was still being reduced to a caricature by men who refused to see beyond her image. From that night on, she avoided spaces where Penn would be present. When asked about him, her response was simple: "Not my energy." There was only one name left on her list, and it cut deeper than the rest. Kirk Douglas and the weight of legacy. Of all the names on Goldie Hawn's private list, the last one carried the heaviest symbolic weight. Kirk Douglas was not a volatile co-star, a rejected suitor, or a rival fighting for relevance. He was a legend, a man whose name represented an entire era of Hollywood authority, discipline, and masculine prestige. And that was precisely why the wound he left behind lingered longer than the others. Goldie entered rooms with Douglas already aware of his stature. She respected history. She understood what it meant to work in an industry shaped by men like him. But respect, she learned, was not always reciprocal. At industry panels and public discussions, Douglas greeted her with exaggerated old-world charm, prolonged hand kisses, winks, remarks about her beauty framed as compliments. To outsiders, it looked harmless, even flattering. To Goldie, it felt suffocating. The message beneath it was unmistakable. She was being seen, but not heard. As conversations shifted toward craft, legacy, and creative authority, the imbalance grew sharper. Douglas interrupted her repeatedly, finishing her thoughts, correcting her phrasing, reframing her insights through his own voice. Each time she tried to re-enter the discussion, he redirected the spotlight back to himself. Moderators noticed it. Audience members noticed it. Goldie felt it immediately. She later described the sensation to a close friend as being reduced to decoration, present for atmosphere rather than contribution. What made the experience especially painful was its subtlety. There was no single insult she could point to, no quote that could be exposed or challenged. It was the accumulation of moments, the introductions that praised men as visionaries while referring to her as charming, the jokes that landed at her expense, the assumption that her success was cosmetic rather than earned. Goldie once said that you could be first on the call sheet and still feel invisible. With Douglas, that invisibility was constant. Behind closed doors, she was more honest. She reportedly told friends that he spoke to her as if she were frozen in time, still the smiling blonde from early roles, regardless of her Oscar, her producing credits, or her creative authority. It wasn't malice, she believed. It was conditioning, a worldview shaped in an era where women were valued for presence, not perspective. And that, to Goldie, was its own form of disrespect. One producer later recalled a round-table discussion where Douglas interrupted her 3 times in under 5 minutes. Goldie waited, listened, then calmly stood up and said she had said everything she needed to say. She left without raising her voice. The room went silent. That moment captured her approach perfectly. She didn't confront. She exited. Goldie never publicly criticized Douglas. She didn't need to. She simply removed him from her emotional landscape. She continued to praise Michael Douglas, often describing him as thoughtful and respectful, making the contrast unmistakable to those paying attention. Kirk Douglas, however, became a symbol of something she refused to carry forward, the idea that legacy excused dismissal. Years later, she summed it up quietly, saying some men don't deserve a second act in your memory. For Goldie Hawn, that wasn't bitterness. It was clarity. And clarity, after a lifetime of being underestimated behind a smile, became her greatest act of self-preservation. Goldie Hawn spent decades protecting a smile that hid fear, panic, and quiet resolve. These 6 men never expected her to remember, but she did. Which name on her list surprised you the most, and do you think silence was her strength or her burden? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more untold Hollywood stories.